I'm Alex Albanak. I'm the Associate Vice Provost for Research Administration at Johns Hopkins University and co-chair of the Federal Demonstration Partnership. On behalf of Michelle Masucci, my fellow co-chair, and David Wright, the Executive Director of FDP, I welcome you to our September 2021 virtual meeting. We're pleased to see so many who have continued to be engaged with us in our virtual meeting format, and we do look forward to seeing all of you in person when it's possible. But in the meantime, we have more than 700 registrants for this meeting, so we're very excited about that, and thank you for attending. Today's schedule will provide an overview of the NIH Strategic Plan, then we'll move on to the Federal Updates Plenary and an FDP business meeting, and during which we will discuss the progress that we've made towards implementing our Phase 7 strategic goals. Following this, there will be a happy hour. You're all welcome. Please attend, and we look forward to seeing you then. Michelle?
Good morning, everyone. We want to remind you that there's still time to register for the meetings and that all of your colleagues from your institutions are welcome to join. So please don't hesitate to share information about the FDP. We will welcome everyone. As you know, the FDP is an initiative of the Government University Industry Research Roundtable of the National Academies, better known as GWIR, led by its Executive Director, Susan Sloan. Our relationship with GWIR is one of the most distinguishing features of the Federal Demonstration Partnership because it means that our activities are connected to the really important convening role that GWIR and the National Academies play in connecting our work to the broad discussions within government agencies, advocates for research, and of course, our member institutions. Without any further delay, I'm going to turn our attention towards this morning's very exciting opening plenary, and I'll invite all of our guests to turn on their video and be ready to go. First, we're welcoming Dr. James Anderson. He is the NIH Deputy Director for Program Coordination, Planning, and Strategic Initiatives at the National Institutes for Health. We are also welcoming Dr. Marino Volkov, who is the Director of the Office of Evaluation, Performance, and Reporting in the Division of Program Coordination, Planning, and Strategic Initiatives, and her colleague, Dr. Sarah Rhodes, who also works in the Office of Evaluation, Performing, and Reporting. They will be discussing the NIH-wide strategic plan that covers fiscal years 2021 to 2025. And their presentation will review how NIH develops and communicates strategies related to its missions and goals, the goal setting process, and the evaluation connected to the strategic plan. So I know all of you will find this to be a very interesting conversation. And as Alex noted, this will be recorded and these materials will be posted on our website for reference in the future. Dr. James Anderson was appointed in September 2010 as the NIH Deputy Director for Program Coordination, Planning, and Strategic Initiatives and Director of the Division of Program Coordination, Planning, and Strategic Initiatives in the Office of the Director of NIH. The division's mission includes identifying emerging scientific opportunities, rising public health challenges, and scientific knowledge gaps that merit further research. The division plans and implements trans-NIH initiatives supported by the Common Fund and coordinates research related to AIDS, behavioral and social sciences, data science, women's health, disease prevention, dietary supplements, nutrition, sexual and gender minorities, tribal health, and research infrastructure. Prior to joining NIH, Dr. Anderson was professor and chair of the Department of Cell and Molecular Physiology in the School of Medicine at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, a position he held until 2002. And prior to that, professor of medicine and cell biology and chief of the section of digestive diseases at Yale School of Medicine. His research at NHLBI intramural program is focused on understanding epithelial barrier function, and he is the recipient of the 2007 Takeda Distinguished Research Award and the 2014 Walter B. Cannon Award, both from the American Physiological Society. Alex?
Our next guest will be Dr. Marino Volkov, who has been the Director of the Office of Evaluation, Performance, and Reporting since July 2018. She oversees the division's mission to provide leadership, coordination, and capacity building to strengthen NIH efforts to capture, communicate, and enhance the value of NIH research through strategic planning, progress reporting, evaluation, and reporting. Prior to this, she was the director of the Division of Science Policy, Communications, Collaborations, and Reporting in the Office of Science Policy in the NIH Office of the Director. Before that, she spent 8 years at the National Institute of Mental Health Office of Science Policy, Planning and Communications, first as the branch chief for the Science Policy and Evaluation branch, then as acting director. Michelle.
Dr. Sarah Rhodes joined the Office of Evaluation, Performance, and Reporting as a health science policy analyst in September of 2018. As the lead for strategic planning, she builds on its role as a centralized resource for strategic planning at NIH by identifying the strategies, tools, and opportunities to strengthen and integrate NIH's capacity for development and implementation of strategic plans. Dr. Rhodes works across NIH to assist in the strategic planning process, including coordinating the development of the NIH-wide strategic plan, which we're going to hear more about today, and towards the harmonization of strategic plans with the NIH-wide strategic plan. She is also responsible for developing the NIH impact pages, which communicate the impact of NIH on public health, society, and the scientific enterprise. Prior to this, Dr. Rhodes worked on science policy issues of significance to NIH, developing policies for the conduct of NIH-funded research, managing the NIH AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellowship, and coordinating a federal advisory committee in the Office of Science Policy and within the Office of the NIH Director. We're really pleased to welcome all of our NIH panelists here today. Just a word about our format, and that is that each presenter will share comments about their section of the presentation, followed by a Q&A for each section. You can use the question and answer tool, which is on the bottom of the screen of your webinar, to be able to enter questions into the queue. We will be curating those questions throughout the meeting. At the end of the entire session, we will open it up for a discussion across all three presentations, again, using the Q&A. So please help me to warmly welcome Dr. Jim Anderson as our first speaker.
Hey. Well, thank you very much. It is genuinely a pleasure to be here with our partners. Throughout the presentation, I'm going to say NIH this, NIH that. What I really mean is NIH, the folks who work in Bethesda, but then also our huge number of folks that we fund, administrators that oversee how the work is done, and the many institutions that we work with. And I'm going to give a presentation on how we developed the strategic plan, the framework around which it's built, some of the themes in the plan, and then some examples of the plan. And then I'm going to hand it over to my colleagues who are going to elaborate on a couple of other topics that are very much related. So on the next slide, please. I will take on our most recent plans development, and then I'll hand it over to Sarah, who will talk about how NIH sets goals, which is very much related to what you would put in a plan. What's the evidence that we use? How do we set priorities? How do we decide what to be funded, what to emphasize? And then very much in a stewardship category, Marina is going to talk about how do we measure progress? What is success? And how do we hold ourselves accountable? So those are the three parts of what we'll do today. We'll take questions in between and at the end. And on the next slide, so specifically about this plan that's covers the years 21 to 25. First to know, who was this plan for? Well, generally it's for our stakeholders, and that's for the public. So we wanted the plan to be appealing with pictures, text that was easy to understand. It's for our investigators, so they understand where NIH is thinking, where we're headed. And then it's also for Congress, because Congress asked us to write this plan. The next slide, please. All right. Well, there are many types of plans. NIH has had plans for its institutes and centers for decades. We have plans for specific programs, even for specific disease areas or conditions. But it was actually not until 2016 that NIH developed a first NIH-wide strategic plan. And this was at the request of Congress in the Appropriations Act in 2015. They asked us to do this, there wasn't a tremendous amount of guidance about what they were thinking and what we would put in it. So we developed a plan which we think worked quite well, and the public has embraced it. And then next slide, please. But then a year after that, Congress came back with a little more direction about what they wanted in the plan. So in the 21st Century Cures Act, which you'll recall, which was signed into law in 2016, they gave us quite a long list of what Congress expected to be in an NIH-wide plan. For example, a minimum of every 6 years. Well, basically all of the plans at NIH are 5 years. So we've decided that the NIH-wide plan will be every 5 years as well. And that is partly because they require that the Institute plans now be informed by the NIH-wide strategic plan in terms of its themes, and also in terms of a common template. They opined that the documents from NIH were organized in all different ways and asked us to please come up with a template that was similar. So working with the Institute directors and staff, we've done that, and that's what's been used for this and all subsequent plans from NIH that represent higher level organizations. Just as an example, I'll give you a few examples of some of the other things they asked for. They wanted us to describe in the plan the collaborations with other agencies and departments, how strategic priorities are set for the Common Fund, near, mid, and long-term scientific needs, and actually quite a bit of specificity, which fortunately we had already put in the first plan. So on the next slide, it turns out that this plan is not a real rewrite of the first one. It's basically incorporating some of the additional requirements from Congress, as well as things that we thought would be appealing to the public. So again, what was our intention? Again, it was to communicate to stakeholders what is the mission of NIH, what are our goals, what are our priorities, and also what are our values and the processes that we use to pursue these goals. And plans can actually be at a very high level, or they can also be at a very fine level, almost like an implementation plan. We decided for the NIH-wide plan that it would remain at a very high level and describe the priorities that were set across the entire agency, not specific institutes. And what did we determine was not going to be in the plan? Well, very specifically, not what all the institutes do. So the NIH-wide plan, some folks wanted to be represented in that plan. The decision was specific programs, diseases would be highlighted in the individual institute and center plans, not our NIH-wide plan. Okay, so with that background and the intention, next slide. It's now surprising to me, almost 2 years ago, that we set out to develop the plan. We started with a phase internally of just organizing who was going to do what, who would sign off, and what was the process. And then also the framework, and I'll get to this. This is interesting. In writing a document like this, you have to have some overall structure that you hang the rest of the content on, and that's the framework that I'll get to. We then took a rudimentary framework and plan out to the public through RFIs, webinars, input from multiple advisory councils, and fleshed out what the plan would look like and wrote it, and then spent about a year getting approval through NIH. And then because of the transition of the administration, that added another 6 months. But fortunately, it did get out within 21. On the next slide. So what I'll tell you about is the framework, the themes, and the content examples for what we're representing as NIH's goals and approaches to get there for the beginning in 21 to 26. Okay, next slide. So here is the framework. How do we organize and present the objectives or our intention and how we're going to get there? This is pretty traditional division in terms of research areas, research capacity, and research conduct. And I want to go back into that. So these are the three themes of the current representation of the plan. In terms of research areas, we often think of a pipeline from basic to clinical application. It's not always that linear. So this plan divides the research that's done and how we set those priorities and why we do it in terms of fundamental science. This is research that's not specifically addressing the need to cure or prevent a particular disease, but creates that repository of information that anyone can tap in to do future applied research. And this is across the spectrum from basic to human studies can be considered fundamental. Then there's the category of disease prevention and health promotion. So what research needs to be done to prevent disease from happening and to maintain health? And then when conditions and diseases occur, how do we set priorities for developing treatments, interventions, and cures, and priorities for what we'll emphasize for the next 5 years? So that's a way to represent actually the research that's being done. The next is kind of unique to, not the next slide. Yeah, the next section would be the research capacity. And this, I know all of you work very much in this space too, is the workforce and infrastructure and resource support. NIH has to largely train its own workforce. And this is from graduate students, undergraduates, postdocs, and even career support. Pharma provides some investment for its employees who might subsequently apply for NIH work. Institutions definitely train in the early stages our workforce, but actually the support, NIH needs to train the people to do the unique work that's supported with our grants and contracts. So there's a special emphasis on that capacity building. The next area is actually physical. It's the resources and infrastructure. And this is everything from construction grants to confocal microscopes to non-human primate resources. So the infrastructure that's required to support the work that's funded. And then lastly, and extremely important, and my colleagues will focus more on this, is research conduct. How do we hold ourselves accountable as an agency to be good stewards of the taxpayers' dollars? Congress had a particular interest in who we work with, and this is public-private partnerships, other agencies, and all of the institutions that you represent. And then how do we hold ourselves accountable and provide confidence that the work is reliable, is rigorous, and reproducible? And then something that's a little bit more internal is management and operations, just as how we work as an agency. And I'll give you an example there too. So we found that there were themes that really resonated across NIH that we wanted to highlight as cross-cutting themes, because they're not unique to any one of these objectives, but are throughout. And they, for this period of time, will be minority health and health disparities. And this was highlighted by the COVID pandemic, the disparity in health outcomes created by the virus, and all of the work that needs to be done to address the disparities. This is also addressing what do we need to do as an agency to address structural racism and its implications for health disparities. The next is women's health, which obviously cuts across all of our areas and all of our institutes. The next, public health challenges across the lifespan. And an excellent example of that, again, is the COVID pandemic. How do we mount a research response? And then how do we prepare for the next pandemic? Collaborative science, a cross-cutting theme. It's obvious that a lot of what we do now requires interdisciplinary teams and working with other types of partners. That's an emphasis. And then the last major cross-cutting theme is data science. And this is big and this is obvious, and it's really throughout everything that we do now. Next slide. Okay, so that's how we develop the plan, why we have a plan, and then the way it's organized, how do we represent our objectives and cross-cutting themes. And now, to make this a little more concrete, I'm going to give a few quick examples of the content that's in the plan. And this is really to create interest in the public. It's organized around things that we've accomplished, so they're concrete and the public can see, oh, that's why we have an NIH. That's what it did for me and my family. There's also examples of things that are in development and things that are ongoing. And I'll try and highlight where these particular examples are setting. So the first is advancing biomedical and behavioral science, and this is the research that we do. Next slide. A terrific example here of basic science is the BRAIN initiative. Began about 5 years ago at the recommendation of the advisory committee to the director, who said, it is just time to take a collective research effort and understand the cells in the brain and their connections so that they can be applied to understanding how diseases work. This is a good example because it's a multi-institute example. It also has partnerships with DARPA, NSF, FDA, and Department of Energy. And again, based on the premise that there's 100 billion neurons in the human brain, each with many, many contacts, with advances in single cell biology, and it's just time to understand what each cell does and how they're connected, so we better understand the brain. So that's a good example, compelling, of a very basic NIH-wide program. Next slide is an example of basic research to develop the universal influenza vaccine. Now, this is a little bit more institute specific. It sounds like NIAID, and it is. But this is bringing together advances in nanoparticle technology to present conserved regions of the virus in an attempt to develop a universal influenza vaccine. So another good and a very applied, and we think it's an example that the public will resonate with. This is what NIH and its funded investigators did for me. The next slide. So this is an example, the HEALS initiative, of developing treatments, interventions, and cures. The HEAL initiative was launched in 2018. It stands for Helping to End Addiction Long-Term. This is a very large program funded by Congress to address the opioid crisis, to prevent addiction, to develop new technologies for pain, and to treat addiction. It is a multi-institute program. It's directed, again, largely from the Office of the Director. It's a big program. In 2019, there was almost $1 billion of awards for grants, contracts, cooperative agreements that were issued in 41 states. So we think this is a very good example, again, of a large NIH-wide program, involves many institutes, and addresses a very pressing public health need. Okay, so those are examples of the research. Now on to Objective 2, which is developing, maintaining, and renewing scientific research capacity, on the next slide. And the next slide. And I'll give you a smallish and a large example. The first is a program that addresses advancing the research capacity of underrepresented groups in research. And this example is the Native American Research Internship Program. It has been at the University of Utah. It's funded at this point about 130 students from about 1/10 of the federally recognized tribes. And it stimulates students from the tribes to be interested in and pursue careers in biomedical research. Again, with the recognition that if you're going to do research that's specific to a community, it's very important to involve members of that community. So we have a very active interest in encouraging tribal participation in research training. And the next slide. This is a different kind of infrastructure. This is resources. It's something that resonates with me as being responsible for the Common Fund. It was about 4 to 5 years ago that it became obvious that many of our investigators were using X-ray crystallography and NMR for structural studies, but at the same time, cryo-EM was rapidly developing as a method that really is better in some ways and faster. Yet the impediment here was that the equipment, the infrastructure for doing these studies is extremely important, and early on was only afforded by a small number of institutions. So we established a Common Fund program that would set up regional cryo-EM facilities, a little bit like the beam lines, to allow folks in different regions to have access to the equipment, but also very specifically to training, so that we could really retrain the workforce in addition to using X-ray crystallography, now to use cryo-EM. And I think this was prescient. We were riding the wave. This has really taken over as a predominant structural approach. And it really was a great idea to set up regional capacity. So that's an infrastructure example. And I'm going to finish these examples. The third area on the next slide is exemplifying and promoting the highest level of scientific integrity, public accountability, and social responsibility in the conduct of science. Next slide. So I don't think anyone would argue with this example, which is not new, but simply access to at least 6 million published articles through PubMed is an example of stewardship, transparency in research, and also is undoubtedly facilitates research throughout the world. So PubMed is an example of just good stewardship, transparency, sharing data, fostering rigor and reproducibility. Next slide. An example that's a little bit newer and a very good example of partnerships is the ACTIVE program. This is accelerating COVID-19 therapeutic interventions and vaccines. This is a public-private partnership that was set up within a couple of months of the pandemic hitting the US, recognizing that if we're going to develop therapeutics and vaccines and test them and get them out very rapidly, this was going to require a huge public-private partnership, which at this point involves 20 companies, the NIH, and many of the federal agencies. It's managed by the FNIH to create our appropriate firewalls with working with industry. And this structure has been enormously successful in identifying potential agents for treatment of COVID-19. Most of them have failed, which is fine in trials, but we have identified through this program, for example, remdesivir, active directly against the virus, which works very well early. Steroids that work when folks are very sick and the virus is not doing the damage, but it's our own immune systems. And this is also the program, with the exception of Pfizer, that has funded and set up the clinical trials for the vaccine trials in this country. So ACTIVE is a tremendous example of a public-private partnership set up involving academic institutions, at least 20 companies at this point, with active management through the NIH. Next slide. This is a little bit different. This is our very active attack, I would say, on ensuring accountability and confidence in biomedical and behavioral sciences through creating a safe workforce. This is our anti-harassment program that has many components, and it's based on the premise, recognition that only in a safe and respectful work environment can all individuals achieve their potential to contribute to research. And it's a response to issues of sexual harassment or harassment in the workforce or in the lab based on sex, gender, and so on. So this is a very active program, both within NIH and also in some policies that touch on our expectations for the research environment where NIH funds work. And then the last, also in this category of research conduct on the next slide. And as I say, part of this was a little bit internal looking. So an example here would be optimizing our operations within the agency. And this builds off an effort from HHS called Imagining HHS, which was started with the last administration. And within NIH, some of our approaches to maximizing the efficiency of the way we operate were things like evaluating workload of our employees to improve the management of resources, to inform our hiring decisions, who really did we need to hire or not, as well as a long list of internal operations, which are really not so obvious to you folks or to the public, but have had an impact. And I guess it's kind of interesting, the image there, as I recall, there was some discussion early on of merging our 27 institutes and centers into a smaller number, or merging them into some functional groups like the Oregon group or the technology group. That didn't catch on. Other things in this whole initiative have. Okay, let me go on to the next slide. Something we did with the first plan was create a short list of bold predictions, which you don't often put in plans if you want to hold yourself accountable for some high risk activities. But I'd have to say, of the 14 predictions in the last plan, about half of them were fulfilled, and the others we made good progress. So this was popular, and with this plan we have 35 predictions contributed by the institutes. And I'll just read one, which is an example of where we need to go, and it's likely we'll get there. And this is the regular use of genomic information. We'll have translated from boutique to mainstream in all clinical settings, making genomic testing as routine as complete blood counts. So it will be interesting to see where we are with that and all of these in the next 5 years. Okay, next slide. So again, what I did was try to tell you something about why we have a plan, who it's for, how it was developed, how it's organized, and with some examples that make it interesting to the public and all of our stakeholders. It's highly representative, and it focuses on programs that are really NIH wide, and it leaves a lot of the details to the particular institutes. But in terms of our themes, such as research conduct, how we set priorities, all of these represent how it's done across all of NIH. I want to thank the folks that were involved in developing this, and then go on to the last slide, which invites any questions you have for this session before we go on to the next.
There are some questions, so I'll read those and we can take it from there. One question is, how did the Cures Act expectations for the plan overlap or not with other statutes governing strategic planning, and notably the GPRA and the Evidence Act?
Yes, well, yes. This was the first description from Congress of how they wanted to see our plan organized. So I think in a way they gave us a free hand with a long list of requirements. for what they wanted this to look like. Now, the Evidence Act, Marina can probably speak to this a little bit more. This deals in terms, there are various parts of it that involve agencies in different ways. For NIH, it's largely addresses the evidence that we use to set our priorities. And there's a multi-year approach to defining what's our capacity to do that. What does that mean? How do we set priorities? What's the evidence? And the application to that is really going to play out over the next few years. So I expect we'll see that in the next plan.
And a follow-up to that is, would any of these objectives or themes have been different if you had written the plan 1 year later, really encompassing the impact of the pandemic?
That's a really good question. We sort of did this on the fly because the pandemic started during our during the preparation of the plan. It doesn't change what's in it. It clearly changed the emphasis. There was, you know, it's always been obvious that health disparities is important and should be a very high priority for NIH. I think what happened during the pandemic was the realization that this was among the very highest priorities for NIH, that the implications were just terrible. If you looked at the outcome that was based on inequitable access to care, pre-existing problems from lack of care. And so we did emphasize that more in the document as time went on. Also, the need to prepare for the next pandemic was emphasized more than it was. But thank you. That is an area that's that we responded to as we admitted that. Well, I'll give you another example. Internally, there was an evaluation of how we supported disease prevention. And this has now been published with a recognition that most of the funding went to observational studies or studies based on the data from other studies. And there was very little investment actually in intervention, and very little of the investment was in groups that experienced health disparities. So we weren't spending the money where it was supposed to make a difference. So that's been a redirection internally with several programs that are directed at intervention studies for health prevention in the populations where it matters the most. Yeah.
That's a really interesting example. Thank you for sharing that. There's a comment and a question that has to do with how AI may change the research capacity. The comment is that there has been discussion at prior FDP meetings about the use of blockchain technology to reinvent the grant management process. And one of the things that's been proposed is implementing AI to accelerate the grant administration process by creating an ecosystem that would facilitate the sharing and accessibility of data that is shared between HHS-funded agencies and institutions. Do you have any thoughts that you would like to share on how AI might change the research capacity landscape at NIH? So not just dealing with the actual program support for grants, but the actual behind the scenes work that many of the people on this call are so involved in.
Yeah, that's a good question. I can't answer that in any depth. It's interesting that you mentioned sharing data, because there is a project sort of with NSF, and OSTP is involved, where we are, as you say, turning grants into mathematical representations of their text so that we can compare applications to different agencies. This is more for the purpose of looking at the content that's going to agencies, but also looking for duplication of applications, which I want to say up front is extremely rare, but it is something that we can pick up with this approach. But in terms of the longer term applications, I'm sorry, I'm probably not the right person to answer that.
Thank you. I appreciate that. There's one additional question, and then we'll move on to the next speaker. And that is, how do the aims and goals of the strategic plan, particularly the cross-cutting initiatives, impact the proposal review process?
You're talking about peer review.
Yes.
Okay, well, these themes are used when we issue funding opportunity announcements. So that would be, there would be an emphasis on areas that we've set as priorities. And then, as you all know, we have peer review, we have council review, but the folks that are held responsible for what gets funded are the institute directors. So that's our third level of priority setting. And the institute directors use these themes as well when they make decisions.
Thank you. I think we can move on to the next person.
Okay, thank you.
Hello. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having us here today. So the NIH-wide strategic plan is one of the tools in NIH's repertoire to help us set and communicate and track our progress on meeting our goals as an agency. So in this part of the presentation, I'm going to sort of take a step backwards and talk more broadly about how NIH sets its goals in general, which is a process that we call priority setting. Next slide, please. So what is priority setting at NIH? So let's put it in the broadest context that we have, which is achieving our mission. How do we achieve this mission? Shown here in the middle of the slide. Well, the simple answer is through supporting research and other research-related activities that align with this mission. So we do this through both a top-down and a bottom-up process. In terms of bottom-up, the majority of extramural research is funded that we fund is investigator initiated. At the heart of this approach is the idea that if an application is of scientific merit, if it's aligned with the mission of NIH, and if there are available funds, then it is funded. This bottom-up approach is vital to moving science forward, but we do also need to make sure that certain areas are prioritized in a top-down fashion in order to take into account specific factors such as public health needs, scientific opportunity, and so on. And this is where priority setting comes in. Next slide, please. So why is priority setting important? Well, the simple answer is that it all comes down to being a good steward of public funds. And there are many sort of sub-answers underneath this. We've listed out a few of them here on the slide. First of all, as everyone knows, NIH is the largest public funder of biomedical research in the world. So this means that our funding of research priorities can profoundly affect the pace of scientific advancements in particular research areas. However, we are not a bottomless well. We are still managing a finite resource determined by annual appropriations from Congress. So we do need to make decisions on how best to distribute these funds. It's also key that we are responsive to current and evolving needs, including, as I mentioned before, public health needs, directives from Congress and the administration, and many other needs. And then finally, accountability, as Dr. Allison mentioned. To be good stewards of public funds, we need to be held accountable to the public and to their representatives in Congress. So our research priority setting process is scrutinized by many. So in addition to setting our priorities, we also must ensure that we communicate them effectively to our different audiences through deliverables like the NIH-wide strategic plan. Next slide, please. So what priorities does NIH set? Well, we set our priorities around 3 key areas. And for those of you who have eagle eyes, you will recognize these from Dr. Anderson's presentation. These form the 3 main objectives in the NIH-wide strategic plan. First of all, research areas. What research areas are we prioritizing? Secondly, research capacity. What are NIH's workforce and infrastructure priorities? And then third, research conduct. What are our priorities pertaining to how NIH-supported research is conducted? So, for example, policies, operations, and management. And I see on your agenda that there are several presentations from NIH related to various priorities in these areas, such as foreign influence. and data sharing. So 90% of our annual budget directly supports research, around 90%, give or take a few percentage. 80% goes straight out the door to our extramural community. 10% stays in-house to support our intramural research program. So in large part, much of the conversation on NIH priority setting is focused on funding of different research areas and research capacity, so the first two boxes. But that does not mean that our priorities around research conduct are any less important. Next slide, please. So at what level do we set priorities? The answer is at all levels. As an example, here is a very sort of traditional model for the levels of organization from the perspective of an NIH extramural program. I will note that although this is a very standard model, the terminology will change from institute to institute and from the extramural to the intramural program, but this is roughly how it will look. With the program at the bottom, with its own mission that feeds into an overlying branch with its own mission, division, institute center, NIH and HHS. So each level has its own mission and sets its own priorities. So I'm going to focus on two levels here, the NIH and the institute level. So NIH sets its broad priorities, as Dr. Anderson mentioned, aligned with the NIH mission, and these priorities span across the whole of NIH, encompassing all institutes. At the institute and center level, well, they set their own priorities aligned with their mission. This is important because, as Dr. Anderson mentioned, the decision on what to fund is determined at the institute level, not the NIH level. So in the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about the organization of NIH in order to sort of zoom in on how our organization relates to our priority setting. So here's NIH's organization. I'm sure you're all very aware of it. We're made up of 27 institutes and centers, each with their own congressionally mandated mission. Their mission feeds up into the main NIH mission. These are shown sort of in the bulk of the diagram here. Just to note, 3 institutes do not fund research, shown here in light blue, and 2 only fund extramural research. They don't have an intramural research program. And each institute is typically focused on a disease area or body system, life stage, or scientific approach. And then we have OD, Office of the Director, shown here in red at the top. OD establishes NIH-wide policy and provides NIH-wide leadership and coordination, especially of activities that span multiple institutes, such as NIH-wide programs that our division actually manages. So how does this relate to priority setting? Well, at the NIH level, OD sets NIH-wide priorities aligned with the NIH mission, including the priorities of NIH wide programs. And then at the institute level, institutes set their own research priorities aligned with their mission. And again, just to reiterate, this is important because the decision on what to fund at NIH is determined at the institute level, not at the NIH level. So each institute makes the final decision on what research to fund contingent on the available appropriations. And in the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about how institutes make their funding decisions and how priority setting comes in. So again, I'm going to whip through this because I know you're all experts. We fund, roughly speaking, 2 broad categories of research at NIH. First is investigator initiated, also called unsolicited or untargeted research. This is research funded as the result of an investigator submitting an application on their own to a broad funding opportunity announcement, or FOA. The flip side of the coin is solicited or targeted research. This is research funded as a result of an institute or a center set aside of dollars for a specific area. So for grant applications, they are made in response to a specific type of FOA called a request for application, or RFA. So as I mentioned above earlier, the majority of applications submitted to NIH for research and training and then subsequently awarded are investigator initiated, that first category. So NIH, as Dr. Anderson mentioned in his questions, NIH only funds research which is approved through a 2-stage peer review process. And both of these types of research go through this process, with the first level being applications reviewed for scientific merit, which is carried out by a scientific review group. made up of primarily non-federal scientists with expertise in the relevant disciplines or areas. And then there's a second level where applications are reviewed by a IC's Institute's National Advisory Council, and they're reviewed for alignment with the Institute mission and priorities. And then after those two stages of review are undertaken, then the Institute or Center Director makes the final funding decision. So the take-home message here is that an institute's priorities influence funding decisions on all research applications, both solicited and unsolicited, because of the second stage. And in addition, those applications in response to solicitations have an extra layer of alignment with an institute's priorities, because they're in response to a funding opportunity which is already targeted to a specific area. So what factors inform our priority setting? This is really a very complex interplay of many factors. I've listed a few here. This is not an exhaustive list, and I would say that this is also true of all levels of priority setting at NIH. The first is the mission. An area of focus has to align with the mission of that entity. Secondly, appropriations. Budget has a huge impact on our priorities at all levels. The appropriations process determines how much funding is available to each institute and center and obligates them to determine how to allocate their own funds among the myriad areas under their purview. In some instances, Congress also may include guidance on funding of different research areas or specific programs. Scientific opportunities, this is a big one. Scientific research advances occur when new findings, so either unexpected or incremental, open up new experimental possibilities and pathways. So we're constantly assessing our research portfolio in light of these latest scientific developments so that we can capitalize them at the right time. Gaps, again, we have to make sure that we identify gaps in both our portfolio and our knowledge base, and make sure that funding is prioritized towards targeting those gaps. Public health needs. NIH responds to public health needs ranging from emerging infectious diseases to the management of chronic diseases such as heart disease. This is important because we really can't predict this is important, and another factor that we need to take into account where this is concerned is disease burden. And this is one of several important factors in setting priorities in responding to public health needs. And NIH analyses show that there are definitely correlations between disease burden and funding. Portfolio analysis is another key factor. We just like any good investor, we strive to ensure the diversity of our research portfolio. And this is because, quite simply, we can't predict the next scientific opportunity or public health emergency. We need to make sure we maintain a balance across the translational spectrum, from basic to translational to clinical and dissemination research, as well as a balance across different types of models, from cellular to behavioral to animal and human models. We also need to make sure that we balance across research focused on a particular area with research with funding of research capacity, so infrastructure and training needs, to make sure we have a sustainable and operable workforce. And then finally, other factors such as I've noted here, rare disease research. We play an important role in rare disease research because, quite simply, this is less likely to be funded by private funders compared to more prevalent disorders. And while research might only benefit a few people directly, time and time again, we have found that the findings of this research area often is applicable to more common disorders. The other thing I will note is, as a mother of a child with a rare disease and a daughter of a father with a different rare disease, although rare diseases are individually rare, as a collection, rare diseases are very common. Next slide, please. So how do we set our priorities? What approaches do we use? I'm just going to highlight a couple here in the interest of time. Strategic planning is one. This is the setting of medium and long range priorities, as Dr. Anderson indicated. Typically, these are 5 years for NIH, and we have input from a whole wide range of internal and external stakeholders in this process. Annual planning complements this. This is really a focus on short range priorities so that we can pivot very quickly to address ongoing and emerging needs. Some institutes actually publicly share, for example, NCI publicly shares its annual strategic plan or annual plan. And another approach is periodic review of research priorities and our research portfolio. I won't go into this in depth as Dr. Volkov will be talking about this, but we do this to make sure that our existing priorities reflect current scientific opportunities, gaps, and needs. We also do this to make sure that our research portfolio meets our current priorities and goals. And we use approaches from very basic analytical techniques such as portfolio analyses and literature reviews, all the way up to full-blown evaluations. Next slide, please. Again, I'll talk very quickly over this. Who plays a role in priority setting? All of our stakeholders. This is a very standard circle of stakeholders here. Obviously, the public and patients are number one stakeholder. Congress, we provide our appropriations. Other federal agencies, particularly those within the Department of Health and Human Services, and Marino will talk more about that, but we are not working in a vacuum. We provide the evidence base through which other agencies act out their mission. Industry, and then last but not least, the scientific community, both intramural and extramural. Next slide, please. So how do we communicate our priorities? Again, I've just put a few examples because at the end of the day, if we cannot communicate our priorities, no matter how well they're set, we're really falling short. So first of all, we have strategic plans, which I won't talk about in too much depth because that was the purpose of the previous presentation. We produce these at all levels of NIH, all levels of that triangle. And as Dr. Anderson indicated, this is to communicate to all of our stakeholders, from the public to researchers to Congress. And therefore, we have to make sure we communicate in a very lay-friendly manner. We also have more targeted communication, so funding opportunity announcements. As I don't need to go into this, you're all very aware of these, but these are very targeted towards researchers. Congressional justification and other budget documents. This is how we one of the ways in which we communicate our priorities to Congress, communicate our priorities all the way from the NIH level, all the way down to, in some cases, the program level. And then finally, talks and publish articles. And we use this to very much target our communication towards whoever the audience is in that particular situation. Typically those most actively involved in research, such as researchers and professional societies, advocacy groups, so on and so forth. So I'm going to end there and we can answer some questions or move on to the next presentation and answer all the questions at the end.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rhodes. I do not see questions in the Q&A, so why don't we move on to Dr. Volkov's presentation and then we can come back and open it up for questions for all the panelists. Thank you so much.
Okay, hopefully you can all hear me fine. Thank you again for this invitation. My colleagues and I are very grateful for this opportunity to talk to you. And as has been presented to you, NIH goes through an intensive process for setting its priorities and its goals. And what I'm going to talk about here is a little bit about how does NIH know when it's making progress towards achieving those goals. And again, it really gets back to that very important question, that was asked right at the onset by Dr. Anderson. When the public says to us, hey, NIH, we entrust you with quite a lot of money every year. What exactly are we getting for our money? And NIH owes it to the public to give them a thorough answer. And next slide, please. That is really all about stewardship, which we have talked about to some great extent today, and NIH is always seeking ways to improve upon its stewardship. By looking at the methods and processes by which we establish our goals and priorities, measuring progress towards those goals and priorities, and then asking the questions if we're going about this in the right way. And that's the evaluative kinds of questions. And then we need to make sure that we are communicating to the public and we're telling them, what is it that you are getting for the money that you have entrusted us with? So next slide, please. As I mentioned, evaluation is a very important part of this. NIH has been doing evaluation for a very long time. And why do we do it? For the reasons of stewardship that I just mentioned. There are also increasing opportunities for evaluation in that we're living in a very rich information age, and there are increasing expectations for evaluation. Before it was asked about how does 20th century cures align with the Evidence Act, which I'm going to talk about in just a moment, and also with GPRA, the GPRA reporting. I think all of you are very familiar with all of these things. I know that this audience weighed in very heavily into the Evidence Act. And the truth is that as long as I have been at NIH, which is quite some time now, I think dinosaurs roamed the earth when I first started, there has always been an expectation on the part of Congress and of the administration that we do a good job of stewardship. We do a good job of capturing what it is that we're providing to the public. And all of these, whether it be GPRA, whether it be the Evidence Act, whether it be 21st century cures, they have really stipulated the methodology by which they expect us to evaluate ourselves. But also a really crucial reason to evaluate ourselves is that we can provide our decision makers with evidence that they can use towards their decision making. I will say that NIH has always been predicated on expert opinion. And it will always be predicated on expert opinion, from our peer reviewers to our leadership. They are always experts, but we can provide experts with more and more evidence that can help them in informing their opinions. Next slide, please. Okay, so the foundations of Evidence-Based Decision-Making Act of 2018, as I said, I think that this audience is pretty familiar with the Evidence Act. The Evidence Act is really designed to allow for the government to do a better job of evaluating its own activities and for making data available to others who would also evaluate it. We in our office, working for Dr. Anderson, we are very much involved in implementing Title I of the Act, which focuses on the ability of the federal government to build evidence about itself. And very quickly, what the Act stipulates is that there be 4-year evidence building plans, that each of those years of an evidence building plan are addressed by evaluation plans, that there be an evaluation policy for the entire department, that there be a capacity assessment, how well can we do evidence building, and that there be best practices and competencies. Next slide, please. So how is NIH implementing the Act? We began last year because for various reasons, we only needed to provide a 2-year evidence building plan. And in that evidence building plan, we focused on strengthening the capacity within NIH to do evaluations and assessments. And to look at capacity, we're trying to do this in a very systematic and strategic way by first examining what data and tools are available to NIH for evaluation purposes. Who do we have at NIH who can do this work? Who is our workforce? And then importantly, what kinds of evidence do our decision makers use, and what kinds of evidence do they need, and how can we build upon that? So next slide. Vitally important to this effort is to really understand the outcomes and the impact of what NIH does, because as you all, I'm sure know, you can't optimize a system in the absence of outcomes. So when we think about the outcomes and the impact of what NIH does, it's an extraordinarily tricky question, which I'll get to in a minute, but it is something that we need to do for all of the reasons that I stated above in terms of why we need to do better evaluations and assessments of ourselves. So just a reminder, as Sarah noted, the mission of NIH is to seek knowledge that is applied towards enhancing health, lengthening life, and reducing illness and disability. How do we know when we're actually accomplishing just that? Next slide, please. As I mentioned, it is not an easy question to answer. NIH is very good at looking at the shorter term outcomes of what we do. For example, the generation of knowledge. We all know, we are all familiar with bibliometric types of analysis and how we look at the papers that are published by NIH and all, but how do we connect that generation of knowledge to long-range impacts on public health? It's not easy. For one thing, we're not responsible for it. We produce the scientific evidence, but others are the ones who pick up on it and actually implement it into public health. We are not health providers. It is up to health providers to do that. We are also definitely not the only funder of biomedical research. There are many, many different players who are contributing to biomedical research. So not everything that happens is a result of NIH funding alone. These timelines are, for the most part, we know it can take a very long time for research findings to be applied to health. Sometimes, as we see recently, not so long as in the case of COVID, and I'll just have an aside that COVID is in some ways a fascinating look that we can take at just how we can expedite the movement of research into practice. And then the final challenge is that one finding could have implications for all kinds of outcomes. For example, how does one begin to capture the impact of gene editing technology? This is something that NIH is very proud of, but gene editing technology is being applied in so many different ways. How do we begin to be able to tell the public, hey, because of gene editing technology, this is what you got for that. So next slide, please. To try and unknot this particularly tricky problem, the NIH director charged the Scientific Management Review Board with looking at different approaches towards capturing impact. And in 2014, I've been at NIH a long time, but not quite back to 1914. In 2014, the SMRB released its report and concluded that we need to take a coordinated and systematic approach to better capture and communicate NIH's impact. And our office is working across all of NIH to undertake their recommendations. Next slide, please. Very quickly, I'm not going to go into real detail on this, but the SMRB asked that we better capture NIH's impact, and that this really involves prioritizing our impact on health. That is our mission. We are here to impact health. We need to be able to understand the chains of evidence by which a research finding becomes applied and actually influences some measure of health. And we need to communicate this better. We need to provide credible, interpretable, useful assessments that attribute outcomes to all contributors. And we need to do this in a coordinated and systematic way. The next slide, please. So in thinking about outcomes, we have organized ourselves to think about it within this framework. Health here in the middle is of the greatest priority and importance because that is our mission. So our mission is so in order to understand whether we're progressing towards our mission, we need to really understand when NIH research goes on to impact health. Is it the number of people who are treated with a new intervention? Is it the number of lives saved? Is it the quality of life? But on the way, as I mentioned, this chain of evidence, there are indicators that might indicate change in health. For example, FDA approvals of new drugs and devices, CMS, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, making reimbursement determinations, which we know is hugely important to healthcare in this country. And are there changes in practice guidelines? Are there new health policies, etc.? When we improve health, that has broader societal implications. For example, a healthier populace means a healthier economy. And there's also the direct economic benefits of NIH funding that spurs forward the biotech sector. So we look for societal outcomes such as that. And then finally, of course, we're a science agency and we live within the science ecosystem as well. I mentioned gene editing technology before. What does that technology mean to science and not just to health? How have people used it in other scientific areas as well? And when have we produced award-winning work, Nobel Prizes, of course, being named? So this is the way in which we have categorized and thought about our outcomes. And we are pursuing a number of different methodologies to try and do a better job of capturing just this kind of data. Next slide, please. So one of the methodologies that was really singled out by the SMRB are case studies. And so we've been pursuing case studies among other methodologies for a whole number of reasons. It's a rigorous way of capturing that chain of evidence that demonstrates the translation of research into practice. It can be used systematically to inform what key factors really make a difference within that chain of evidence. And it can help us to identify factors that we may not have even thought about. It's a great communication tool because it can tell a great story. So we have been working across NIH and attempt to sort of build up a library of case studies on important NIH research findings. Next slide, please. This slide is absolutely impossible to read, and I'm not asking you to do that. I just want to provide this as an example of a case study that we've worked on, and also it's the best a way I know of to show this actual chain of evidence that's necessary for research to move to actually influencing health. So we did this particular case study on the Hib vaccine. Haemophilus influenza type B bacterial illness used to take a terrible toll on children in this country. And the introduction of the Hib vaccine in the mid-90s dramatically changed that. And so what we did is we went about looking at this timeline represents all the steps that were necessary for to move from foundational research that led to a very early Hib vaccine, and all the work that was subsequently done to refine that vaccine and to make it widely available. And next slide. In this case study, we captured a variety of outcomes that came from this, but this is the really most important outcome that we wanted to show you, and that is with the vaccine, the Hib disease was nearly eliminated in the US. There are so many things that come from the elimination of Hib vaccine, but of Hib as a disease, but this is the most important study on that. So we are doing case study work. We are seeking to systematically increase our capacity to do evaluative work in general. We are looking at ways in which we can better capture our progress towards stated goals by coming up with new metrics, both quantitative and qualitative. There are a whole host of things that we're doing, but next slide, please. And we're doing this in partnership with many, many different players, going back to actually capturing health outcomes. When you think about it, when you think about the importance of FDA approvals, when you think about the importance of CDC recommendations, for almost virtually everything that NIH does, in order for it to actually impact health, it needs to touch some other part of our very own department. It is the Department of Health and Human Services that changes health in our country, and we have the vital role of providing evidence for our partners within the department to change health. So, and as I mentioned, CMS, Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, boy, when they make a final rule or when they come up with something that they will actually pay for, it changes healthcare in this country. And that's a huge thing to understand our relationship to the activities of CMS. So we're working across the department to sort of understand the flow of evidence as it goes from one part of the department to another. And then, but it is not just our department that we need to think about working with for all of this activity. Next slide, please. Sarah mentioned all of our stakeholders and priority setting. These stakeholders are our partners also in understanding our impact, understanding whether we're going about our processes in the right way, all of that. And I look to all of you in that I think the FDP has played an important role for many, many, many years for NIH in terms of our stewardship and our stewardship activities that I've talked about today. We also, of course, need to work with the private sector, such as pharma. We need to work with other entities within the government that are scientific entities, such as NSF. And we really need to work with our partners in the extramural community, again, noting your importance. And with that, I'm just going to end with, if we go to the next slide, please. I want to end with the case study that I showed you and other places where we try to meet that goal of communicating our impact in a way that is comprehensive and understandable to the public. We do that on our website, The Impact of NIH Research. You will find under our stories, you will find that HIP study that I mentioned before. And this is where we are trying to build our library of case studies. And just if so, you know, we are in the middle of big redesign of this page and would very much welcome any comments that you all might have about this and actually anything else that we've talked about today, given the importance of this community to our work. So with that, next slide, thank you very much. And I understand we have some questions.
Thank you so much for that, for this very in-depth presentation that you, as well as our other panelists, and I invite all the panelists to make themselves available. I have some questions ready to go, and we may have others that come in. So one is related to evaluation and assessment. Do you have different frameworks for intramural and extramural activities?
Boy, that is a great question. I would say that in the vast majority of our evaluative efforts of our formal evaluative efforts have relied upon or have looked mostly at extramural. But that being said, there is an important evaluative process for intramural that's a little different than the evaluative process for extramural. I know Dr. Anderson can speak to that process of intramural evaluation if you would like us to go into more detail on that. Jim, anything you would want to add to the intramural evaluative process?
Not in any depth. What I will say is kind of interesting is we have looked at the outcomes from the work from extramural and intramural. And it's interesting that if the intramural program produces more work that generates clinical guidelines or is cited in guidelines. It's more patents. It's what the generalization that I will make is that the intramural program is much more focused on influencing human health in general than the extramural program. So the extramural program is huge and it covers everything. But I think it's because of the NIH Clinical Center. There's such an emphasis on clinical impact in the intramural program, and we've documented that clearly.
There's a related question, which is that is capturing the impact when awards are more complex, such as large awards with many subawards. So I think going into this issue of how does scale and complexity affect the evaluation process?
Yeah, and I will tell you there are multiple efforts underway, again, to take advantage of the more and more availability of data to try and begin to go up a level. NIH has traditionally undergone a really rigorous process for evaluating individual grants. But how do we evaluate, say, networks? How do we evaluate large multi-site studies? How do we begin to capture their impact and even to roll that up higher into even larger priorities? For example, Dr. Anderson talked about the HEAL initiative. Lots of discussion right now about the many different ways in which we can capture progress on the HEAL initiative, which involves a lot of multi-site studies, networks, and so forth. So it's we are looking to ever refine our ability to do that kind of broader evaluation.
Thank you so much. There's a question that came in, which has to do with the NIH policy on data management. And that is simply, do you have any insights into what compliance checking and/or new processes that will be implemented as a result of the policy might show and demonstrate with respect to this evaluation process?
Yeah, Marina, you want to give that a shot?
Yeah, I will tell you, there's a lot of discussion going on about how do you actually capture the outcomes of data sharing efforts? How do you know when people have used data that's available and how have they used it? It is cited in papers, but not always so cleanly. And there's an awful lot of consideration being given to how we can do this better. We had a workshop a few years ago working with, and I should note, there's a really robust extramural community in the science of science policy, which again, I think many of you are involved with. And working with that community, we've been asking these questions of how can we better understand when shared data is used for a whole wealth of purposes. So luckily we have an Office of Data Science Strategies, and within that office under Dr. Anderson, and that office is looking very carefully at all the different ways that it can evaluate these really tricky questions.
Thank you so much for that insight. It wouldn't be the Federal Demonstration Partnership if we didn't ask a question on reducing burden. So I welcome anyone on the panel to comment on how that goal of reducing administrative burden, which obviously is something we work on in partnership with all of our federal partners here at FDP, how is that factored into the strategic planning and evaluation process? Anyone can answer.
I can jump in on that. And, you know, it really, as we think about it, it's all about linkages of data, existing data. How can we make it easier for our extramural community to provide the kind of data in which we can link our activities to those data and we can see the outcomes? And important to that, I talked about evidence flow through the department. Wouldn't it be nice if the extramural community as well as NIH had a easier, more automated way of understanding when these outcomes or when these papers that are published, for example, are used by CMS in a determination? That would be vitally important to the extramural community, I think, for your universities to understand that, and it would be vitally important to us, and we can do it through data linkages. The data is there now. It's a matter of really figuring out how to link that data. And within NIH, we're doing the same thing. The information that we generate, how can we centralize it? How can we aggregate it? How can we coordinate it better so that there aren't multiple asks for the same information? And this is the information age. We have the opportunity to do that. I don't know if anyone wants to add to that.
I was also going to say, you've indicated it's a FDP priority. It's also definitely an NIH priority, NIH-wide priority, and it's in our strategic plan under Objective 3, research conduct. So we wanted to make sure it was highlighted there for everyone to see that it's something that we're really focused on as an agency.
That's fantastic. And I'm sure everyone is making note and they're going to go and look at that and be able to relate to that in terms of our own strategic planning, which we're going to talk about a little bit later on today. Here's a last question for us, and that is, will broader impacts similar to what is required of NSF proposals become part of proposal progress reports in the future? In essence, speaking to what the broader significance of the work is.
There is already a public health relevance statement in applications. I do not hear of any talk, and Jim and Sarah might have heard, but I don't think that that will happen at any point. I think the public health relevance statement is enough in and of itself, and we are already thinking about how can we use that statement in and of itself to begin to think about where might we see the signal of impact coming from that statement. The kinds of impact work that we are discussing here today is not something that we are going to rely on our individual grantees to provide.
Yeah, I don't have,
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
yeah, nothing to add in that. We don't call out the need to recognize an international impact. I mean, it's captured in terms of the whole public impact statement.
Yeah.
And I will point out, we have the Fogarty International Center is focused on having an impact of our work across the world. The Common Fund has multiple programs aimed at advancing research infrastructure and health in Africa. NIAID funds work all over the planet in infectious disease. If the question relates to whether we support international research and its impact on health, NIH does.
Well, we have really appreciated this fascinating presentation, and given that we're in the midst of thinking about strategic planning for the FDP, it's quite a timely presentation as well. I want to thank all of the panelists, and on behalf of my colleague Alex Albanak, I want to remind everybody that we have our federal update session that begins at the top of the hour at 1 o'clock. I hope that you will join me in sharing your welcome through emails and other comments that you may share with us in the feedback related to the session in our post-conference evaluation process. So thank you all so much for your presentation on the panel, and we'll see you all in the audience soon in the next session.
Yes,
Bye,
thank you
everyone.
very much.